The following program is a production of the Hennepin County Library.
Hi, welcome to a discussion with Nancy Pickard. I'm Bruce Southworth, a mystery reviewer for Drood Review and Publishers Weekly. Nancy Pickard's series of Jenny Cain books started with Generous Death in 1984, and the newest one, Confession, is published by Pocket Books in August of 1994. And along the way, she's written many short stories and also finished a novel by Virginia Rich, from her notes, called The 27-Ingredient Chili Con Carne Murder.
Very good. Very few people get that the first try.
It's longer than most books, it seems like. Welcome. It's good to see you again. Thank you for coming.
Good to see you, Bruce.
I thought just basically start out with Confession, the newest book. Jenny and her husband, Jeff, are living peacefully and quietly, and that peace is sort of upset or shattered by the arrival of a young man named David Mayer.
Yes.
And he claims to be Jeff's son.
Jeff's illegitimate son from what is essentially a one-night stand 17 years before. That'll upset your Sunday, let me tell you.
Indeed.
And he also is there not necessarily to claim any kinship with Jeff, but because this boy's mother, and the man he always thought of as his father, died in an apparent murder-suicide within the year. And the boy doesn't believe the man he always loved as a father could have done this terrible thing. And he very angrily demands that Jeff, who is himself a police officer, solve this crime. Come up with a different solution is what the boy wants. And then he storms out of the house, leaving Jenny and Jeff stunned and looking at each other as if to say, what now?
Yeah, what actually happened?
Right.
We've been hit by a tornado.
Yeah.
He spends a lot of time apparently leading them through a lot of clues into various areas of Port Frederick, which in this particular case has grown considerably. It's now almost a metropolis, it sounds like, with its various areas of nouveau riche and the original rich and so on. So
it almost had to, Bruce. When it started out in Generous Death, it was, as you know, more like a little village. In the second book, I luckily gave them a new harbor development, which could stimulate economic growth, and it's a good thing because in the series so many people have been killed off that we needed a population explosion, I think.
Well, you also got some spare room when those 132 bodies sort of disappeared out of the cemetery, so there's places you could put some of those.
That's right, yeah.
One of the very intriguing things about this, I think, is the exploration that you do between the relationship of Jeff and his son, or his illegitimate son, and that son and the man he considers to be his father. And it struck me that a couple of books ago in IOU, you did a similar sort of thing in a way with Jenny exploring her relationship with her mother, who had just passed away, and then her relationship with her sister. Was that, I mean, the two...
No, until you mentioned that, I think that's the first time I realized there was that parallel. I hadn't thought of it in exactly those ways, but that is true, isn't it? In one book, I've explored essentially relationships of daughters and mothers, and in another started to think about the relationships of fathers and sons. It's funny about writing fiction. You think what you're writing is coming up strictly from your own imagination, and then it turns out that Carl Jung was probably right, and there is a collective unconscious, because you start opening the newspaper and everybody else is talking about the same thing too. And one of the things I think people are talking about now during this summer of 1994 is the relationship of American men with American boys. And part of that is that the O.J. Simpson trial is current right now. The focus is to a great extent on the relationship of black men with black boys, but I think that's far too narrow a focus, and those of us who are not black are kidding ourselves if we think we don't also have questions to ask ourselves about the relationship of any man with the boys in our society, where the biggest troubles seem to be arising right now. So in what I hope is a fairly delicate way, I mean, I hope there's nothing in here that's a real message that hits you over the head. I hope I've begun to explore that whole realm a little bit, because I'm very interested in it, in a time in which families are changing and all our definitions are changing, but yet we still have young men growing up who need the guidance of strong male figures as well as strong female figures. So that's kind of what I wanted to get into in this book, as well as the whole question of punishment. I'm real interested in our conventional thought about punishment, and I touch a bit on that in this book too. It's
Painfully.
Painfully, right. It's funny, Margaret Maron, who, as you know, is a wonderful mystery writer, talks about the fact that one of the difficulties of talking about mysteries is you can't say much, because if you talk too much about a book, you give away too much. So someday maybe you'll have to do a locked room show in which only people who have read a book can tune in, and then we'll all talk about the entire book.
We should get an audience out here, and
That's
then,
right.
and then only broadcast it, you know, put a warning on the label or something.
That's right.
FBI warning. Yeah, that is one of the difficulties in this. But just to expand or explore the relationship of fathers and sons a little bit further, the role has changed quite a bit, and it seems to be redefining itself again. As you say, there's the major family values discussions that are going on, and the need for young men to acknowledge paternity and so on. It struck me that that is kind of at the heart of Jeff's thinking here. Is he's trying to decide the responsibility that he has, what kind of commitment level.
Yes.
And the other interesting thing is the sort of the shift in thinking about relationships between men and women, or boys and girls.
Yes.
From the time where he would have had his one-night stand with her, and it was just one of those things, and she was easy and so on, to now the more kind of sensitive sensibility.
Where two grown men talking about those days are even a little bit embarrassed about how they used to view the girls back then. Yeah, you're exactly right. That is something that was real interesting to deal with in that book. And part of what I wanted to talk about too, because I've always been interested in the phenomenon of the girl in high school that everybody thought of as easy. Now we know a lot about those girls. We know some of the reasons they may have become that way. And we tend to look at them sometimes with a bit more understanding and sympathy than maybe we did when I was in high school, which would have been in the 60s. And so there were whole lots of things as we talked that I realized I was dealing with in writing this book.
Yeah, it's a very multi-layered sort of a thing.
One thing I didn't touch on that may spring from this, and I'd like to talk about in some book, I think, is when we talk about the relationships of men with boys, as this book does, which I think is very important, one of the things as women, we've avoided talking about, I think, is how our attitudes toward men affect the boys we raise. For instance, I think there are a fair number of women in this country raising boys and alone, and if these women feel contempt for men or hatred for men, how does that affect these boys they raise? I think that's a real worrisome question. So I think that at some point I'll probably want to deal with that question too.
That's very interesting. I'm aware of someone who has an issue with a son right now where he's a very aggressive boy, and the father says, let him express it, let him get it out of his system, but channel it.
Yes.
And the mother says, no, we have to stop him from doing all of this and repress it. And so it becomes a very interesting relationship, not only with the son, but between the parents trying to decide how to deal with the child.
Yeah, interesting times.
Yeah.
May you live in interesting times, right? The old Irish curse.
Indeed. Next thing you'll have to tackle is probably the relationship between fathers and daughters, which is that special one.
Yeah, Jenny has a sort of flaky father who's hard to pin down, hard to have a relationship with, but that's true. That would be fun to do too. Well, I've got my career charted out for me right here.
The next 3 or 4 books just worked
right.
out completely. Well, speaking of that, you, I understand, tried something different during the writing of this. You, local writer R.D. Zimmerman has for a long time used hypnosis as an aid or a tool in working on his books, and I'll admit it, I have no clue how that works, so maybe you can...
I use it and I have no clue how it works.
Okay.
Yes, R.D. and I both use hypnosis tapes made for us by Dr. Donald Hoagie, who is in Edina. Am I pronouncing that right?
Right.
Edina, Minnesota. And they're 15-minute tapes that are tailored to our particular needs in regard to a particular book. And the mechanics I can explain the mechanics of it. That's very simple. I can't explain how it really works. But every day, when it comes time for me to want to write or not want to write, I put this tape in my tape player and listen to it for 15 minutes, and it never fails. After that, I sit down every single time and write. My minimum these days, I've kind of gone back to basics because I have a deadline in October. I'm trying to write a minimum of 5 pages a day, and ever since I started using this tape, that's what I do, 7 days a week. I'm on a book tour right now as I talk to you. I have my laptop computer with me, and every day on this book tour, I've been writing. writing without much sense of strain either. So, and why does it work? Beats me. It serves as a bridge between my reluctance to work and the actual writing, I guess.
Kind of overcoming the discipline problem of
I
sitting
think
down
so.
and just make yourself do it.
I just hope I don't get too smart for myself and start resisting the tape, because then I'm in big trouble.
Then you'll need 30-minute tape, perhaps.
Right, a tape to get into the tape,
That's
to get
right.
into the tape.
Into a nested recursion sort of thing. Now, how do you work out with this doctor?
When he's in Edina and I'm
yeah.
in Prairie Village, Kansas, just over the phone. I call him, I talk to him about my life and what I hope for in a book, and he listens very carefully. He must be a phenomenal listener and a very intuitive practitioner, and then he sends me a tape which just seems to be tailored perfectly to what I'm doing.
And what kind of things does he do?
On the surface it appears very simple. For instance, I mentioned this last time that in my life when I'm not writing, I'm working out on a treadmill, running on a treadmill. So he worked that into the tape somehow with the paying attention to my body and how all the muscles work together and the coordination of it, and how when you reach a pulse rate of 150, your body starts feeling real good. And somehow worked that into what I wanted with my writing, which was to look forward to it, to run this marathon with pleasure, and to feel a sense of coordination from the beginning of the book to the end of the book. So it just worked great. I met him while I was here in Minnesota, and he laughed and said that, asked me if I'd signed up for the Minneapolis Marathon yet. So
And you hadn't?
I hadn't,
You
no,
hadn't come
but
back for that.
subliminally, yeah, maybe I'm working up to that.
So in having done that now, this is the first book you've done that with, right?
No, I did the end. No, yes, you're right. It is the first book I've done that way. I get confused between books, but I'm working on a book called Good Intentions. It will be the next Jenny Cain novel, and that's the second book I've worked with.
And you feel that there's kind of a dramatic difference in establishment of the work habit, or do you like the feel of the output a whole lot better?
Both. It makes the whole process easier, is what it does, Bruce. It's less of a struggle. And I wanted it for this book, Confession. Mention the name of one's book as often as one can. I wanted it for this book because I reached the end of this book and I had so much going on that I felt I was lost in it. I needed some perspective. And so that's what I told him. And so the tape for this book was to help me draw back, get perspective, and bring the whole thing together and race toward the conclusion. And then I wanted something different for the next book. So it just makes the process easier. I suspect it also helps me get to that place within me at which I can write from the most genuine place that I'm capable of doing, too. But I can't prove. That's sort of up to the reader to say, well, yeah, this feels as if you got it right.
Yeah, I was kind of interested because and I don't know if it has to do with character or the relationships that you're exploring, but this and I'm showing my bias, but this and IOU, I think, are my two favorites in the series, largely because they are both very emotional, very tension-filled.
Yes.
There's more action in this, in the sense of, kind of things going on, lots of subplots and whatnot, as I recall it anyway. And so, I wonder, you must have found that place in IOU sort of on your own, or stumbled across it, or whatever.
Yes, I think that's true. It's interesting. Most people do pair those two books. That's why at the top of Confession it says author of IOU rather than author of my most recent book. Because, as you know, because you've, thank you very much, kept up with my series, the books are not necessarily all the same tone. Some books are much lighter than others, and it tends to be that the people who like the lighter books are less likely to be as enamored of the more serious books, and vice versa. You like IOU and Confession the best, and people who like one or the other tend to pair those. I didn't say that very well, but you got the idea.
No, I got the idea very, very well. Yeah. One of the books, and I've never confessed this to a writer, actually. There's the title of the book again.
Thank you.
That, let's say, I liked perhaps less in the series than others, was Bum Steer. And
which other people say is their favorite, and will I please do another book like that? It's so interesting.
It's very interesting to see what people really like.
It sure is, yeah.
I don't know what it was about that one, but well in advance of when you wanted to tell me what happened.
You weren't interested.
Well, I was interested because I wanted to know how you got there, but I'd figured it out.
Well, you were smarter than I, because it took me to the middle of that book to know what happened.
And I understand that there were a lot of so shall we say, editorial things that went on with that book. Didn't you?
Oh,
You
that
end up
was
doing.
fun.
Had to redo a manuscript or something, or
What happened was that when I was working on that book, I was having trouble with it, and so I decided to try writing a novel the way I was writing short stories. Before that time, when I had written novels, I had started at page 1 and plowed all the way through to the end. And I had started writing short stories by writing scenes in whatever order they appealed to me to write, so that I might write a scene at the beginning of the story, and then at the end, and then at the middle, and not worry about where they fell in the story, but then stitch them all together. Well, it worked great in short stories. And then I did it with a novel, with Bum Steer, and I sent it in to my editor, and she called back and she said all the nice things editors are supposed to say at first. And then she said, there's only one thing. She said, do you think we could have a plot?
oh,
I had forgotten this petty insistence on plot. And so then I had to go back and think about plot. Now, I sometimes do have to make dramatic changes. In a book called But I Wouldn't Want to Die There, which is set in New York City, the book just before Confession, I sent in the manuscript, and she called, and she said the nice things that editors say, and then she said, there's just one small thing. And my heart sank.
and you said, not plot again, my
Yeah,
God.
I thought I had a plot. And she said, I think you need a different villain. And the minute she said that, I knew she was right, that I had hung the wrong guy. You never want me on a capital crimes case. I mean, I am an argument against capital punishment. So I knew she was right, but I didn't know who had done it. And I said to her, do you know who did it? And she said, no, I don't. So I decided I would do one of the 3 or 4 things that writers do to jog their imagination. I would take a shower, or I would go to sleep and have a dream, or I would take a walk. And I'd already had a shower, and I wasn't sleepy, so I went for a walk. Oh, the other is to play solitaire. Lots of I don't know if you know that.
No.
A lot of writers play solitaire to jog. I don't, but they tell me it works.
New writers,
New
beware
writers,
of this
beware.
advice.
That's
yeah.
right. Yeah. So I took a walk, and sure enough, it sprung loose who the real bad guy was. Maybe detectives do this. Maybe detectives are walking around Manhattan thinking, now who really killed that person? And then they get the idea. And so when I called her the next day, that it had occurred to her too, the same person. So we figured we were on the right track, and rather like 2 detectives conferring on a case. And then I saw that most of the clues were there for a smart person to see. I had just missed them. And then it was just a matter of highlighting what indicated the villain and fading into the background the things that seemed to implicate someone else. So it's a real interesting process. I like to keep mysteries to myself. I like to fool myself. Sometimes I do it too well. But I figure if I'm surprised, perhaps the reader will be sometimes as well.
So you don't start out with a complete picture of this is the killer, this is the victim.
No, no. Sometimes I think I do. I'm almost always wrong when that's the case. And I don't like to do that. I'd rather be surprised along the way because it just makes it a lot more fun to write.
I would imagine it would, and then you can be, as you say, as easily pleased and surprised as the reader.
Oh, it's a good thing I have a good editor, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. That brings me to another point I wanted to ask you about good advice and bad advice. I was reading an article, and I'm going to use the appropriate visual aid here for people. This is the August 1994 Writers magazine. I don't know if you look for it in your library. It's an appropriate place. But there's some wonderful, wonderful advice in here for writers. Some of them, the things that people should not do. For example, the advice that is bad. A couple of writers said, write what you know, which I thought was very interesting because that's usually what people tell you to do, and you say, okay, fine, I'll go do that, and then you realize, I don't know anything.
Yeah.
It's kind of strange. And the one other in particular one I thought was, let's see, actually is a skill to cultivate. And I wanted to quote this because I thought it was just hilarious. From Garrison Keillor, modesty. This is, again, a skill to cultivate modesty. Writers are some of the most important people in America today. You didn't know that,
I didn't
did you?
know that.
Doing the most crucial work, bearing a heavy responsibility as the last exemplars of American entrepreneurship and cussedness. It takes brains to write, and you can't fake it.
Yes,
and
you can.
He goes on. But I thought that was very interesting. So I was curious, over time, what you've had in the way of advice, good and bad.
Yeah, I've had some real good and bad advice. Mostly good, I think. The whole idea of write what you know, I think I would change that to write what you read. That's sometimes a good idea. I read mysteries, was real familiar with mysteries. And write who you are. Not necessarily write what you know, but write who you are. Be as honest as you can about how you really feel and think. And most of us can't just do that just like that. we have to grow up a little bit and be willing to face who we are and what we think before we can bring that authentic voice out onto the page.
You mean you have to know what you want to be when you grow up?
You have to know what you want to be. Always a tough challenge.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't know till I was 36 or 37 years old, but I was real sure at that point it was going to be fiction. Yeah, that's right.
Someday I'll figure out what I want to be when I grow up.
One of the other good pieces of advice I ever ran across was from a writer, published writer, who very early said to me, if you ever encounter someone who makes you feel like not writing, run like hell in the opposite direction. And so I tell that to students. If they and I had a terrible professor in college. The only creative writing course I ever took. I presented my first short story to him, and he read it aloud in class to hold it up for contempt, and led the class in laughing at it. And it discouraged me from thinking of myself as a fiction writer for the next 15 years. Turns out he did me a favor of sorts, because I was forced to learn how to become a writer of other sorts and develop the tools, and also just live instead of burying myself in writing. It took me a while to figure out he was a jerk, and it didn't have anything to do with my writing. So if I'd had that piece of advice then, I would have left that course instantly and gone and found somebody else to learn how to write from.
That's one of the other pieces of advice that I did read in that article, is that if you are seriously thinking about quitting writer, you never should have started, because it's an obsession that you have to keep doing.
That's right. So when people come up, as they do, believe me, and you know this too, they'll come up and they'll say, well, you know, I'll write a novel if I ever get the time. I said, don't talk to me about time. Time is not the issue. I wrote a novel in 15-minute increments. And I know a man who is a quadriplegic and writes his novels with 2 fingers on his computer. So don't give me time. Give me desire. If you really, really want to, no matter what the circumstances of your life, it'll get done because you won't have a choice.
Desire and discipline, and just force yourself into it.
Well, desire gives you the discipline, is what I think.
Okay, yeah.
It really is a case of you reach a point at which you're more unhappy not doing it than you are doing it. Than not doing it. You're more unhappy if you don't do it
than doing it. Yeah. Okay, I gotcha. In doing that, you mentioned also your short stories, and so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that. Now we've got sort of the drive and the desire. How do you approach constructing a short story? Well, you've talked about it, stitching sort of scenes together, and it didn't work that well in a novel. How do you kind of approach one versus the other? I mean, they're radically different forms, really, aren't they?
They are different forms. In a novel, you have to hold more things together. I'm not quite sure why the business about stitching scenes together doesn't work as well in a novel. I don't think I have a good answer for that. The difference between a short story and a novel, to me, is that in a short story, you have a chance of feeling that it is complete. Short story is usually about one epiphany, and it'll be a moment of awe for either the character in the story or the reader or the writer. But there is that epiphany. I learned this from a fiction writer by the name of Gladys Swan. I saw her in a conference one time, and when she said that, I had an epiphany. I'd been getting nothing but rejections for my short stories up to that time, and when she said that, I realized that's what was missing. That I was trying to write short stories that had no ah moment in them, and that changed forever my way of looking at short stories.
How do you get
ah?
Yeah.
Well, that's like, how does hypnosis work? That's the place I can't actually describe. It's just that suddenly, maybe it's that you're looking for something that operates at a deeper level. I think I was trying to write short stories that had a gimmick to them rather than any real depth of emotion. And I can look now at those short stories, and a couple of which I have since published because I like them. They're okay, but I can see that they have nowhere near the satisfaction that some of my later stories have, where I was going for a little deeper emotional impact.
Yeah, just kind of combining elements to make everything kind of coincidentally work or something.
Yeah, right. The MacGuffin or something.
Yeah. Changing course completely. I was curious about one thing as I was reading, actually as I've read most of your books, and as I've read a lot of other mystery writers, and that's the subject of names. I think an author naming their character is very interesting. Because the names can come to mean, I mean, they're sort of associated in a lot of respects with that particular person's character, or maybe physical appearance or something like that. It's not a writing situation, but take the TV series Ironsides, for example. Here's this fellow in a wheelchair with iron wheels, Ironsides. It's cute. But how do you come up with deciding the names of your characters? Maybe back with Jenny and Jeff, but all the people that are populating your books?
It's really tough, and I have a hard time getting away from basic white Anglo-Saxon Protestant names. Names are tough. I've done all sorts of things like scan magazines, look at newspaper articles, looking for names that seem to bear with them a load of character. I do think that most writers would say you never really get hold of a character until you know the person's name. And if you try to write that character without having a name that feels right, and then you come across a name, you always have to go back and rewrite, because it's magical how it changes the character just by having the right name. Sometimes I just get desperate and I go ahead and name somebody, just anything, in a first draft, knowing that I still haven't got it, that I'm going to have to come up with something that works. There are funny little things you have to consider that seem very trivial about names. Sometimes writers get stuck on names starting with certain letters. I'm real fond of names starting with M. So I may go through a first draft and discover I have a Mason and a McDonald and a Mary and a
mayor.
And a mayor, right. And this was tough because I have a woman who's the mayor of the town, and I have a family named Mayor.
That's right. I didn't think of that.
So you have to watch that sorts of things. There are writers who, once they've published a lot of books, have to keep lists of their character names because they're so stuck on certain names that they'll keep using that name without being aware that they're doing it. I've done that too. So names are oddly difficult.
Yeah, it's always fascinating because sometimes I think the names of detectives that people come up with these days are just kind of intended to be cute, catchy.
Yeah, I think so
and
too.
not real, and that annoys me. That's one of the things when I flip open a book and read the blurb, I go, oh,
yeah.
It just sounds like they're pulling too many cute elements together. So
Yes.
it's nice to get a real sounding name. I mean, Jenny Cain is short, it's sweet, and I mean, it kind of describes her. And Jeff has a harder edge to it.
Yeah, Jeff, I wouldn't have named it, I wouldn't have spelled it the British spelling if I'd been thinking straight when I started out. Nobody knows how to pronounce it.
Really?
Yeah, they want to call him Jeff. The Americans are not familiar with that spelling for some reason. And I just shouldn't have spelled it that way. Jenny's name, when I did it, first of all, I didn't have a child yet. My child was within a year of being born, but I didn't realize that every third kindergartner girl was named Jenny. I might have thought twice about that. And I also didn't think about Jenny Craig, the diet people. A lot of people will come up to me and say, I just love Jenny Craig. And I just say,
I've noticed you put a little bit of a twist in that in there. You start to come out in here, speaking of names.
With Nancy Drew.
With Nancy Drew, and well, Jenny, of course, has popped into Kansas, and there's another reference to Kansas in there. So are you trying to escape a little bit?
From
Nancy?
Kansas or from Nancy Drew?
Well, no, from some within the pages of your stories. Are you trying to peek out a little bit between the curtains?
That may be. It's interesting. I really think, in an odd way, the whole Nancy Drew phenomenon is quote-unquote coming out. I just read a review of Sarah Paretsky's new book, in which evidently she has made some references to Nancy Drew too. And this is interesting to me, because when I first started writing Bruce, I would sometimes get reviews in which they said, this is Nancy Drew all grown up, but they meant it in a pejorative sense. I would just sort of chuckle and think, good, that's just fine. All those women who read Nancy Drew. Now, there's even been a Nancy Drew conference, an academic conference. The whole impact of the Nancy Drew character on several generations of American women is beginning to be taken rather seriously, where it used to be treated as something to joke about. And I think it's time for a lot of us to acknowledge our debt to Nancy Drew. She really was, in many ways, the foremother of the women's movement in this country, in my opinion.
I think you're right. Well, you were ahead of your time in that acknowledgement, and we are out of time, so I don't know where it went. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruce.
Pleasure.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.